Good afternoon. I'm Rose Stevenson. I'm the Director of Policy and Strategy at the Higher Education Policy Institute, also known as HEPI. Welcome to this webinar where we will be examining a report that we published late last year called Student Working Lives. And this is diving into the detail of the changes in the student experience. As we know, more students are working part-time and students are working increasingly long hours, and what that means for their student experience, but also their academic outcomes. This is a 1-hour webinar. My job is to talk as little as possible so we can hear from our speakers, but also we can have as many questions towards the end as possible. Our numbers are still ticking up, but we're about 250 people watching at the minute, so I'm hoping there's going to be plenty of questions. As your questions come to you, pop them in the Q&A box down at the bottom there. You can also upvote the questions you want to be asked, and we will ask the most popular questions first. On HEPI webinars, if we can, we like to turn on people's microphones, not their cameras, but just their microphones so that they can put their question to the panel. If you'd rather we didn't do that, just ask it anonymously. I'll put a little note and I will read out your question for you. So that's it from me. We're going to kick straight off with Professor Adrian Wright, Assistant Dean and Director of the Institute for Research into Organisations, Work and Employment at the University of Lancashire, who is also one of the key authors of this report. So Adrian's going to talk us through his findings. Off you go, Adrian.
Thanks, Rose. And as I say, these are the key findings from the Student Working Lives project, co-authored by myself, my colleague Mark Wilding, Mary Lawler, and Martin Lowe. Just to provide a bit of information on the context, really, and what we've seen over recent years is increased media attention on student paid work, public discourse, really focusing on this. But what we found, or one of the things that we looked at in our study, is that often the discourse on student paid work treats it as a homogenous issue, often overlooking the diverse and intersecting challenges faced by different student populations. As the cost of living crisis continues to rise, and we find inadequate financial support mechanisms, meaning that students need to work, and paid work has become an essential part of university life. This was underlined by the HEPI Advanced HE Student Academic Experience Survey that found 67% of students now work. So what the Student Working Lives project intended to do was really to dig in to this issue and provide a little bit more insight into the topic, the challenges and the issues that students are facing. So just while the slides move on, what we did was a national project focusing on the quality of student paid work and the impact of student outcomes. We partnered with 4 university partners, Buckinghamshire University, the University of Liverpool, University of Lancashire and London South Bank University. I'd like to extend my thanks to colleagues within those institutions, because without the work that they did, we couldn't have done the report that we did. We surveyed 1,044 survey participants, linking student data with self-reported data to really look at the student experience and the impact of student outcomes. And alongside that, we interviewed 25 students, universities, and sector observers. And we published the HEPI report in November 2025. So we encourage you to look at that report if you haven't done so already. So just looking at the detail. So firstly, we answered the question of why and where do students work, and we found that financial reasons dominated participant responses as to why students work, suggesting that work is a necessity and not a choice for students. We can see here on the image on your right-hand side that students work to pay bills, to avoid being in debt, often to support family, and often to pay university fees. We found that student employment is clustered around health and social care, retail and hospitality sectors. And what was quite interesting to us were these were industries and sectors with high social value, and often sectors that, particularly in COVID times, for example, were considered as key workers. We also found that students found their work through employer websites and friends and family, rather than accessing university services or other services that were there to mitigate the quality of paid work. Looking into student workload, we found the average student workload inclusive of travel time amounted to 50 hours a week, and we included travel time to get an idea of the overall student time commitment. Crucially, this figure grows to 57 hours a week when we look at students with care responsibilities and 52 hours a week for commuters. And we also found that place matters. So, for example, there's a divergence in student workload between, for example, London South Bank University and Liverpool. We also found that discipline matters. So students studying certain disciplines have a higher workload than others. So, for example, those that are studying in health orientated subjects had a higher workload, averaging about 55 hours per week. I think one of the things we really wanted to dig into and look at was the quality of student work and how that compared with the overall population. And some striking statistics came through from our research. We found that 44% of students felt fairly paid for the work they do in comparison with national statistics around 52%. We found crucially that only 44% found their jobs productive, 37% described their job as meaningful, and 38% of students felt supported by their colleagues, and even fewer felt supported by their manager. Strikingly, 43% of students told us that they reported experiencing stress, anxiety, or depression caused by or made worse by work. And 38% of students were on 0 hours and casual contracts. And the quote on the right-hand side of your screen really brings that to life, where you've got an example where a student didn't know whether they would be working in their job until they turned up, and having to foot the cost of the travel to work without any guarantee of actually being able to get any paid work once they got there. One of the benefits of collecting institutional data was we were able to consider attendance and academic performance alongside self-reported working hours. And what we found was striking in that we found that students that worked under 20 hours a week were 20% more likely to gain a good honours degree. We also found a clear relationship between work hours and attendance. So for those students that worked 1 to 9 hours a week, averaged 64% attendance, but that dropped 10% for those working over 20 hours a week. Also, those working over 20 hours a week were 16% more likely to consider withdrawal. So this underlines the impact of paid work hours on academic performance and attendance and engagement with the studies. But also quality of work matters, and it does impact on studies and outcomes. So we found that students that experience supportive and meaningful work that aligned with their skills are more likely to succeed academically. Conversely, students that are working night shifts or in roles without flexible arrangements are less likely to be on track for a good honours degree. What this means for us is strategic investment in enhancing the quality of student employment can improve student engagement and can also improve student outcomes. So, in summary, what we found was the cumulative load of employment and study results in students facing over a 50-hour working week. We found that time poverty that students are experiencing results in a lower academic engagement, students working longer hours, attend less classes, and report lower attainment. And crucially, quality of work matters, and it can hinder or alleviate student success. And we put together a set of recommendations for government, bodies and regulators, universities, to really think about how we can improve the conditions of student paid work and the student experience. And those include, for government, acknowledging the financial realities of students and aligning policy decisions to minimum income standards. Thinking about how we could use, for example, the international student levy to provide a partial rebate to higher education institutions based on student worker contributions to regional growth sectors, with the QAA reviewing study hours guidance per module, and perhaps asking whether the OFS could consider paid work as a new risk on the Equality of Opportunity Risk Register. We're asking universities to look at timetabling and assessments to develop them with student commitments in mind, update mitigating circumstances policies to recognise paid work, refresh cost of living information regularly, and develop credit-bearing modules that recognise paid work alongside repositioning career support to support paid work. We're also asking the question of whether universities, local authorities, and employees can collaborate to provide meaningful employment opportunities for students that fill regional skills gaps, consider whether a student employment charter can improve student paid work, and whether student unions can partnership with universities to offer employment rights trainings to students. And that's my summary there. I'm back to Rose.
Brilliant, Adrian. Thank you so much. I think something that really strikes me about this report is the fact that students who are working over 20 hours are less likely to get a good degree. And they're working so hard. They're doing a whole degree and they're working 20 hours in paid work in term time, and they're not getting the outcome they deserve. And from an institution's perspective, I think it's hard for them to say to a student, you need to work less hours, because they, like you said, it's not a choice that they're working this. This is about survival. But you talked about the quality of work, and that can, if you have a better quality of work, there is less impact on your studies. And I just wondered to what extent you think good quality work can mitigate that impact of hours worked.
Yeah, so I think the findings for us were clear. If we look at the individual components that we did on the relative risk register, we find that, for example, those working flexibly have 10% better chances of getting a good honours degree, or those that have meaningful work, it's something similar. I think what is really interesting is these work cumulatively. So often, if a student has more meaningful work, better quality work in terms of flexibility, better quality work in terms of support from their manager and colleagues, then they'll have a much better experience. And I often think about it as a student that's going from a university to a workplace where they feel isolated, unproductive, without support, and the impact that must have on their overall experience alongside their university experience.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. Just to remind you folks, if you've got questions, try and put them in the Q&A, not the chat, because I will find it easier to find them. So we are going to next pass over to our small but mighty panel. So first up, we have Amira Campbell, who's the president of the National Union of Students for the UK. We'll hear from Amira first, and then we'll hear from Martin Edmondson, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Graduate Futures Institute, formerly known as AGCAS, which is a professional organisation for all who contribute to careers and employability in higher education. So Amira, over to you first, please.
Yeah, and thank you, Rose, for introducing me, but also thank you, Adrian, for presenting all of that information and being part of the team that have put all of that together. I sort of wanted to start off with a couple of the headlines from what's already in the report, but I won't go into too much detail because obviously Adrian has already explained a lot of it in quite a lot of detail. But I think that actually a lot of the headlines, a lot of us aren't surprised by, right? Like no one is surprised that students that are working less are performing better, that those students are the ones that are less stressed. No one is that surprised in the current day after what people have been talking about for years and years, that the number one reason students are working today is to pay the bills. That isn't a debate anymore. And we know there are other complementary reasons, and I think this report actually does a really good job of painting that as well. But no one's surprised that students are working to pay the bills, right? Or for the other reasons, saving for the future, avoiding debt, supporting their families. I think probably a bit more surprised we may be about how many students are actually having to use that money to pay for their tuition fees, something that we've been talking about, the impact of the raising of tuition fees in terms of for our poorer students, for those who are more debt averse, and the challenge that's also happening for those who are paying off during their studies. But a lot of this information, although depressing and harrowing, is not necessarily new. And actually, some of the conclusions that this further evidences, this data, is probably quite logical, even though we haven't been having those conversations. I don't think many of us are surprised that for the students trying to cover the bills, the number one organisation to go to isn't the career service, because the sort of jobs that they need are the ones that they can get quickly, that pays well, and in that immediate sense, that is flexible. And we've got lots of students on sort of 0-hour contracts, casual contracts, jobs that students can start as soon as possible, not the sort of jobs that they have the luxury of waiting for when it comes to summer studentships, when they've got bills right then in those winter months that they need to be paying for. So I think a lot of those headlines we all knew, but I wanted to deep dive in a couple of things that I thought was really interesting within this report. And the bit that I thought was really fascinating was some of the qualitative data about students' working life experience, their experience working. You know, the conditions that students are working in are poor. They are 0-hour contract, they are casual contracts, and students are reporting high levels of stress, anxiety, depression associated with their working lives. But what was really interesting were some of the specific stories that students were telling. You know, the unsupportive and isolating working environments that students were facing. I mean, the report showed that 1 in 5 students were working night shifts. And I think it's one thing for us to say that students are working alongside their studies. It's another thing for us to say that students are working the nights between the days when they go to their lectures, right? And maybe there's something that we need to do to communicate that message more clearly so people understand how terrible the situation is. But even the frustrating stories demonstrated within the report, I think there was one specifically about a student that was traveling and paying 25 quid to travel to a warehouse only to find out that they didn't have the shift and that they just lost that money, and this happening on a regular basis. The sort of work where they were making a loss and had to compensate for that loss on their other shifts. I mean, this is the consequence of the type of casual work that students are taking on alongside their studies. There's also a really detailed section in the report about international students. And I wanted to give it just a little bit of time, but put a magnifying glass around it. And although it's not drastically different from probably what a lot of us already knew from the stories and the conversations that we hold with international students and our peers, it's really interesting to see the same patterns that we see a lot when it comes to collating data around international students and their work. Right, we have less hours reported per week for fairly obvious reasons that are actually cited in the report, but also very clearer, poorer working conditions faced and detailed and described. And I think there's a real there's a real concern around what's happening for our migrant students, that the challenges and barriers they're facing accessing work, and particularly the fact that many of them are accessing poorer work, poorer conditions, et cetera, and are often less catered with a skill set to fight back, push back, or hold their workplaces accountable in the same place, in the same way. Now, it would be amiss if I didn't say what I think this all comes back to, right? And it does come back to an intentional defunding of access to higher education, or of higher education, but particularly for young Brits, year on year on year, this lack of investment in higher education. And specifically when we're looking at how this defunding is impacting the working lives of students, I think there are mitigations that various different stakeholders can take when it comes to our student unions, when it comes to our universities, and when it comes to government. For our student unions, it's primarily, we've already seen the mitigations that they're taking, whether that's community pantries, community breakfasts, hardship funds, whether that's supporting students to unionize effectively in their own workplaces and not just understand their rights. For our universities, whether that's offering employment, we've got lots of universities that are becoming those employers of students, and often those better, higher quality employers, whether that's offering welfare and well-being support services, whether it's student support funds. For government, I think the mitigations are things like shifting the loan system, grants around thresholds. I think thresholds is actually specifically named during and mentioned in the report by a student who speaks about how they haven't moved since 2008 and what that meant for their parents being able to support them during their studies and why that student's been brought to work. But I think at the end of the day, the desperate change that needs to take place, it cannot be this constant reshuffling of little bits of money here and there. We need to continue working with all of these different groups and all of these different stakeholders. But at the end of the day, we do need to move to a more sustainable way of supporting young people, particularly through higher education, because higher education is not this endless pit of money. And we cannot continue to keep digging into the pockets of either our international peers or those who do not hold the money to hold up higher education. So I just want to say a massive thank you for this report, for the detail that it holds around all of these different issues. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation to come.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Amira. And thank you for raising the issue of international students, which I know you will hear endlessly, as I do, the kind of multifaceted challenges international students face in terms of their cost of living. Okay, Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Rose. Really great to be here on the session, and thanks, Adrian, for a great report, and Amira for your thoughts as well. Really, really powerful stuff. So my name's Martin. I'm from the Graduate Futures Institute, recently rebranded from AGCAS. We represent everyone who works in careers and employability in higher education. It's great to see, even in the comments in the chat, a good few of our members here. I guess I'd perhaps come at this from a slightly different angle. Clearly, there are a bunch of challenges here around part-time work and some of the conclusions around how there are dangers and hazards in terms of things like poorer degrees where students having to work a lot of hours. But I also think we potentially can look at the opportunities that emerge from this as well. And I'd like us to perhaps do a bit of thinking about that. And I've got a couple of lenses I'd like to look at that through, in terms of one of the things, particularly in the report, the idea that we think about how do we recognize this work is going on. We largely, I think, have to accept that this work is taking place. Students are having to work part-time, as Amira was saying, and Adrian, to pay the bills. That's pretty much now a given. So how do we rethink how we're approaching this as universities, both as a whole university, but also through things like our career services and careers teams, to think about how we extract the value out of this? Because I was looking at some of those students' examples, even looking at the charts and the hours people are doing, and thinking there's going to be some pretty hireable people here who've developed a set of skills and attributes that have come through the complexity of the work that they've done. And actually what we need to do is help find models and approaches and ways that we can extract and pull out the skills and attribute development that's taken place in that part-time work, and find ways to more formally recognize it and pull it out through the work-based learning models and curriculum models and career support models that we have in our universities. Now, the good news is this is an area that career services are already working on really heavily. The vast majority of our members have some kind of part-time job shop type model within their career service. So they're already supplying and supporting a lot of part-time work and trying to shift that towards higher quality, whether that's through, I think, as Amira mentioned, work inside the university itself, or through sourcing good quality part-time opportunities as well. So this is an area where there's already a fair bit of work going on. But I think we do need to think perhaps in three other areas about where we can extract the value out of this a little bit more deliberately and a bit more consciously for the benefit of the students and graduates. So I think the first is thinking about what implications this has for work-based learning generally. Now, one of the things we know from HESA data is that, for example, when it comes to 1 year placements, if you like, that sort of, which I know is only a certain portion of the market, but there's a clear link between improved graduate outcomes, improved long-term salaries, and people who've done that placement. So we already understand that for students who have a combination of work experience and the amazing attributes and development that takes place through higher education and their degree, they tend to get better outcomes one way or another. So what we've got to do, I think, is harness the cocktail of those two things in different ways. Now, the ideal path to that is work-based learning that is in some way related to their course, or at least is developing skills that will help them move from their course into their desired kind of pathway. Now, one of the challenges we have with this increased amount of part-time work is it potentially pushes out course-related work-based learning. So if, for example, I've heard of a number of instances where we've got a situation where there might be, for example, a 6-week placement, which a student can't take up because it might cost them their part-time job, and their part-time job is essential to do the work. So I think that what that asks us to do is think about how might we redesign those placements to be more flexible, dynamic, to be little and often, to be scattered in amongst things, to be perhaps delivered virtually in part. And we know there's some great models being delivered on that already in a number of our universities in this country. And I think we've drawn from models in Australia as well, where they do this particularly well. I think the second big implication we need to think about is curriculum and credit. How do we take and make deliberate the skills development and the attribute development that is taking place in part-time work, and then give it credit, whether that's through careers and employability modules that exist in some degrees, or whether that's just in more mainstream modules within the course, where we just are much more deliberately thinking about the graduate attributes that the university is trying to develop, and how some of that part-time work might be feeding into that and be given credit. So I think that's one thing for us to challenge ourselves about in thinking about how we're designing degree programs in order to extract the value out of this part-time work that is taking place. And then a final one, I think, is about thinking about skills mapping and understanding the skills development that's taking place across a student's time at university and how this part-time work plays into that. So some really interesting innovations going on. So, for example, at Kingston University, where they put their entire second year students through an assessment centre. One of the interesting things about that model is that it gives them a readout on their skills against the Kingston's skills framework attribute model. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't also, for example, for those universities that have some kind of job shop or temp agency, when the student goes out and does some part-time work through that, as well as getting perhaps the timesheet back, we capture feedback from the employer on the skill development that's taken place of that student. And we start to aggregate that data both for the benefit of the student so they can understand the skills development that's taking place and that this isn't just kind of work to pay the bills, that actually what's going on here is some really useful development. And then from the employer's perspective as well, they can see that they're playing a role in helping us develop the skills and employability of our students and graduates. And I think developing these models is also really important from a social capital and a social justice perspective as well. Because in the end, the vast majority of students that are having to put a lot of this work, it's because they haven't got other resources, family resources, they're not wealthy in background. And so, again, I think the onus is on all of us, the whole university level, not just the career services, although I think they are the absolute engine room of all of this, is to think about how we look at curriculum, how we look at work-based learning, and how we look at skills mapping to think about how we capture the value, play it back in, both back to the students so they understand the development taking place and they can see the value, but also we can then play that into a wider picture of skills and attribute, conscious skills and attributes development taking place through someone's time at university, which incorporates everything from their education, their work experience, their part-time work, and perhaps their extracurricular as well. And it's building that holistic view of the student, a whole university approach to both the approach to employability and then how that drills down to the personalized experience of the student. So whilst there's lots of challenges here, I think maybe there's some opportunities we can grab hold of as well.
Thank you, Martin. That's so useful and great to hear the work that many career services are already offering. I think your point about placements, that we take placements very seriously, we know they're good for employability and they're often credited on a course, but we're not recognizing that when a student might be doing the same amount of work, possibly the same quality, although perhaps that is harder in part-time work, and how we can join those two dots together, particularly when some of those students are being pushed out of the placement opportunities because of working, is really, really key. And hopefully we'll get a chance to dig into that a bit more in the Q&A. So I will refresh my upvotes. Okay, so this question, there's a number of similar questions like this, and so I'm glad it's the first one, and it's anonymous, so I'll read it out. It says, can you expand more on the recommendation to reposition careers services to support student paid work? I'm not aware of any careers service which don't support this, but it may be how it's being defined in the report. So Adrian, perhaps I can come to you on that one. I also have John Rushford next. Emma, can we switch on John's mic and John can ask a question?
Okay, I mean, just to respond to the first question around repositioning paid work. I mean, I think from what we found was that lots and lots of career services do great work in supporting students with getting job opportunities during the studies. We found, I suppose our provocation in the report was, is the balance right between supporting students during their studies and supporting students into graduate jobs post-study, and asking career services teams to reflect on that balance rather than suggesting that these things sort of don't exist currently, and just thinking about how that could be enhanced and improved.
Adrian, am I right that when you asked students how they found a job, the career service was lower down the...
That's right, yeah. So I think I think from memory it was about 3 or 4%, and I think that's really I think there's a broader issue around student engagement with university services, and the breadth of student engagement with university services, which is it's across the board really. And I think it's whether students recognise career services as the place to go to support good quality paid work, and what work can be done in that area.
Yeah, brilliant. So from the chat and the Q&A, I think there's lots of careers folk on the call today. It sounds like careers folk are saying we're doing this, we're doing this work, but maybe there is some kind of mismatch between students being aware of that and turning up for it, and it being offered. So a really interesting point. Okay, over to you, John.
Okay, thanks. There's always a link between education outcomes and employability, but I wondered, and I take the point that this type of work affects the education outcome. Is there any evidence that it affects either negatively or positively the actual employability outcomes for students engaged in this type of work?
Thanks, John. So Martin, I'm going to come to you for that one, but I'm just going to pose a question to Adrian, who might want to think about this because it's quite techy. It says there's a big discrepancy between the labour force survey, which shows that 37% of 18 to 21-year-olds in full-time education are in employment, and the student academic experience survey, which you referenced in the report, which I'm an author of, which has a big increase to 68% of students being in employment. And if he's asked if you have any thoughts on that. So I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Adrian. But Martin, so part-time work, is it making students more employable?
Well, I think there's a couple of angles you can think about this. There isn't any really good data on this for the start point. And actually, that's one of the things we're working on at the moment. So we've just launched a quarterly data barometer, and the second one of those is taking place at the moment. And so this is really annoying because we'll have some more data on this, but in April. I'll perhaps be able to give a more useful answer at that point in terms of the scale and breadth of some of this. But I think there's two angles maybe to answer that question. I think one is obviously looking at graduate outcomes data and thinking if we can isolate certain students and look at outcomes in that sense. And I think there would be some value in doing some more detailed studies on this as a kind of next phase of research to look at what the impact of that is. Because my gut would be that actually, going back to my point earlier on, whilst there's clearly some challenges in the part-time work, actually, if we can help through the work, particularly a lot of career service work is about helping students to realise the development that has taken place. And I think this is what we can, as well as giving them access to the part-time work, it's then about helping them join the dots between what's gone on in that part-time work and why that's of value to an employer. And then I think the other angle is think about it from the graduate recruiter lens. And I certainly know that graduate recruiters take part-time work really seriously. So I've spent a lot of time working in the graduate recruitment space as well as careers and employability. And this is something when people are passing applications through their processes, where students can both demonstrate work and show how it's developed skills, that will go a long way in graduate recruitment processes. So there's definite value there, 100%. We've just got to get better, I think, as institutions as a whole, at finding routes and pathways to pull that value out and help students realise the value that has taken place.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think we have to be careful not to frame part-time work completely negatively, because it can have value. Like you said, I certainly worked at university and I found it really helpful in my career, all the work that I did. I also lived with someone who is a medic, and she had never been to work until she turned up in hospital on the 1st of August as a junior doctor, which I thought was a bit wild and probably shouldn't be allowed. But I think we need to, you're right, how we manage to capture that and almost validate it for students, or give them the language to validate it for themselves when they're looking for their graduate jobs is a really key part of this. So Adrian, I asked you a really techie question. I think Jonathan Neves is on the call as well. So if you want to speak, Jonathan, do feel free to join in. Jonathan's another author of the Student Academic Experience Survey. Adrian, what do you think? What's the difference in this data with the labour force survey?
I mean, the first thing I'd probably lean on is sample sizes and age ranges between the 37% of 18 to 21-year-olds and those that are often we survey in our study, which is slightly different, and those in the academic student experience survey would also be different as well. I think also in terms of this, I think the ONS data that we look at suggests there's approximately 1 million student workers, and that's been fairly stagnant over the past few years, but then has had a rise fairly recently in terms of the last couple of years post COVID. So I think we could lean on that as well. Really, I'd be interested in Jonathan's thoughts too on the discrepancy there. But there are a couple of explanations that I would consider.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the Student Academic Experience Survey, which is a survey that goes out to full-time undergraduate students, 10,000, actually had quite a similar number to your survey, Adrian, which was specifically targeted at 1,000 students across 4 different institutions. So, and that number was quite similar and obviously quite a lot higher than the labour force survey, which does have a few recognised challenges. But it is an interesting point, and maybe we can go away and have a little bit more of a look at what's different there. Okay, panel, I am going to ask you 2 more questions. So I have Patricia Woodman. It's quite it's a similar question, but slightly different to what we had before. So Patricia, I'm going to ask you to put your question, please, to the panel.
Thanks. Yes, I think it is fairly similar to what's been talked about there recently. I was just curious as to whether the report did actually look at how students felt about their part-time work and whether they felt they were gaining anything beyond pay from it. You know, skills, boosting their levels of confidence, as you know, confidence interacting with people, particularly when they work in the kind of hospitality and the retail sector. I always think confidence gets you at least 50% of the way, and if you don't have it, it's a real disadvantage. So just that kind of thing, really, about how students felt, whether they were actually gaining anything.
Brilliant. And Amira, I might come to you on that one. Johnny Rich, you're up next, please.
Thanks very much, everybody. Yeah, I've asked 2 questions, but I'll try and turn them into one, which was around the differences between subjects. And obviously some disciplines involve much longer hours than others, or much longer hours in classes and so on. And so they leave little opportunity for paid work during the daytime. So what are the implications for access to those subjects? Also, more widely on the access issue, I saw that there was some data on the breakdown of socioeconomic backgrounds, and that's pretty much even across the board. But are they getting different kinds of work?
Okay, brilliant. So 2-parter from Johnny there in terms of subjects. And is there an access issue, which we know that there are with some subjects? You know, for example, medicine, that there are access issues, but are some of those related to not being able to work because of high hours? And quality of work for students for different backgrounds. I think that's probably enough to get us going. But Amira, I'm going to come to you first on, are you hearing from students that they feel a benefit from part-time work?
I think the answer is that it is mixed, right? I mean, even the survey shows that there are students talking about like really meaningful experiences that they're having with work, building relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And I think very much in what we see with, I mean, many people outside of study in the working world, some of them are having really positive experiences and some of them are having absolutely terrible times in their work. I think what's going on here, though, is the difference between a student that is almost getting fortunate in their working opportunity, right? Many of them are doing it because they're struggling financially in the first place, and they're turning what is a terrible or bad or difficult situation into a positive. They're managing to gain skills. They're managing to make something of it. What concerns me is the high proportion of students that are in that same predicament, but are not enjoying their work, that are under really difficult working conditions, that are getting paid really poorly. And what can be what could be dangerous in this conversation is when we talk about, well, because X number of students are having a really great time in work, that it's suddenly okay for us to expect multiple young people to be taking on part-time work alongside their studies. There's also then the question, because we talk a lot in the student movement about placement and whether it should be remunerated or not, whether people should be paid for the amount of labor that they're doing in that space or not. And I think this is another one where you've got people working legitimate jobs or doing very real labor, and because they're gaining from it or they're learning from it or they're having a positive experience in that space, often as well not always having a positive experience. So I'll put that in the context of placement. But because of those positive attributes, that they shouldn't be remunerated or that they shouldn't get the money back that they ought to have, even though they don't have the time to work part-time alongside that. And so I think we end up with some really dangerous false positives in this conversation that we need to be really careful of. I think it's good for us to acknowledge good quality work. I think it's good for us to acknowledge good practice. But I do think we need to not get to a place where we're going, because of this good practice, we should justify this stance or continue to end up in a situation where so many young people are being expected to work alongside their study.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, Adrian and Martin, if I could come to you for your thoughts, please.
Adrian, after you.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah, I mean, just to underline, I mean, from my point of view, I think that, there is evidence in the report to suggest that a reasonable amount of work at good quality is good for students, and partially for the reasons that Martin suggested. They can, if the students are getting transferable skills, experiencing workplaces, gaining confidence, understanding how to navigate the labour market, all of these things are vital for students to gain better employment opportunities post university. But I think the important thing for me is that these jobs are good quality, that sit well alongside students' studies, and that aren't a detriment to the students' experiences at university and complement them. I think that the tension that we see in the report is when it becomes too much with difficult work conditions that then have an impact on the study, which isn't desirable for them, universities, or anybody.
And your thoughts, Adrian, on Johnny's questions on access. So in terms of accessing subjects, but also being able to access good quality work, and is that driven by students' backgrounds?
Yeah, so I'm going to defer that a little bit to some extent to say we didn't see from memory a clear relationship between IMD profiles and type of work. As we said in the report, the hours were pretty pretty consistent. What I would say is if Johnny wants to get in touch, we can look at that data in a little bit more detail. I can't pick it off the top of my head. So I'll have to say, please do email me and I'll try and provide the answer.
Thank you. Martin, your thoughts there in terms of access and impact on students being able to find good quality work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, the things like the job shops and that are being run by careers teams are pretty focused on better quality work, and are increasingly working with universities to look at where there's part-time work available on the campus itself, which is great. I do also think, though, we need to remember that skills development can take place in crappy jobs as well. So, like, I did a builder's labourer job in the summer between university. I mean, A, you wouldn't want me building your house, and B, it was miserable work in the rain, lobbing stuff around. It was really not very enjoyable at all. But I learned some stuff. I learned some things about myself. It was not massively well paid, but development still takes place. So I think this is the thing, that whilst we can't necessarily guarantee the quality of all the work someone does in part-time terms, and I'm not even sure that's in the gift of higher education, but it's what we can do is help students to step back and go, sometimes when you're young and when you're in the early stages, especially of trying to build career experience and things like that, you have to do some jobs that aren't that great. But actually, if we as institutions, through our career services, through academics, through our work together, can help people see what skills development take place there, see what it's taught them about what they do and they don't want to do in the long term as well. There's value in that, and I think so. I think whilst yes, let's strive for work experience that we can source and support. And I think one thing we could invest more in to make this happen more is in the employer engagement side of things, like our universities in general and career services in particular, because actually there isn't much substitute for what you'd kind of describe as in the recruitment industry, I suppose, kind of old school shoe leather of getting out there and building relationships with employers in order to generate opportunities, whether they're part-time opportunities, full-time opportunities, graduate jobs for students. So I think this is an area, and I think the report sort of references it as well in terms of where there might be space for investment, that we should really look to invest in, so that we're really well equipped as institutions to go out, build employer relationships and generate the best possible range of opportunities across the board, from part-time work through to graduate jobs.
That is fantastic, particularly because you've also managed to answer the next question at the same time, which was the role universities can play in providing good quality work either in the institution or nearby. And I think that is increasingly becoming a really important part of kind of university provision. So thank you for your thoughts there, Martin. So I have a question from Deborah. Adrian, I don't know if you're going to have these to hand. And Deborah is in transit. So her question is, for the first figure, I presume from your slides, Adrian, what is the breakdown for the percentage of commuter versus non-commuter students working for financial reasons? So I know you looked at commuter students, but I don't know if you have that to hand. And then Chase Greenfield, I'm going to come back to yours so that Adrian has a chance to think about that one. Simon, I think we've answered the first part of your question, which was, but if we could switch on mic on, if Emma, we could switch Simon's mic on. So the first part of Simon's question was about the correlation with IMD groups, which I think Adrian's already answered. But Simon, you had a point about whether this should be added to access and participation indicators. Can you just talk us through that a bit more?
Yeah, and it's useful to hear the reassurance there isn't a skew across the socioeconomic classes, because I thought it probably would be. But I just wonder whether, if this is something that's having such a big impact in terms of student outcomes, whether it is something that we should be reporting in some way, whether it's part of the indicator set, and we should, and it may be difficult to track, but I thought it was quite an interesting thing that so mmany of our students are engaged in activities that are not helping them with the studies. It's something we should be watching and monitoring.
Brilliant, thank you. So Amira, I'm going to ask your thoughts on that one, but Adrian, I'm just going to come back to you on the question of commuter students. Was there any difference there between commuter and non-commuter students working for financial reasons?
Yeah, so commuter students are more likely to work, for example, to support the family. Non-commuter students are more likely to work to study, to pay bills, cover university fees, and to socialise. That's the broad headlines in terms of the commuter versus non-commuter student motivation.
I think this was a bit of a surprising finding in terms of the commuter students and the extent to which they are supporting their family and their household. It's quite a high percentage, I think. Yeah,
it is. And one of the things that we wanted to explore was a bit more of a reverse dependency, in the sense that often we see commuter students having some sort of support from the family, but what you see in our reports and what we see from the research that we've done is a reliance on students to support the family unit, rather than what would typically be seen the other way around.
Great, thank you. So Amira, in terms of universities kind of monitoring their students, what could be done here with recognising the students that do work?
I mean, I think it's important that universities are keeping an eye on the numbers and understanding how significant the impact of work is having on their students, particularly when different universities have very varying demographics of students and the impact there. But I'm also then cautious about what weight we put around different types of work and how we measure it, because the types of work that different people at university are taking on are so vast, and because the reasons are so different, it's really hard to come up with a clear idea of what the situation is or what the challenge is on your campus from sort of blanket figures. I think universities should be keeping an eye on it. They should be looking at it. They should be seeing which departments are most affected and what course studies are being affected, which students from which backgrounds are being affected, how they can try to counteract that. When it's an indicator that a student needs financial support and help and they're not getting financial support and help, I think it's absolutely pivotal that that student is aware of the support that they should be getting while they're in study. And there are probably ridiculous numbers of cases where students aren't getting any financial support or applying for various different funds that they are eligible for whilst taking on casual work that's detrimenting their own studies. So I think it really is about that piece. And when students go into career services, and this probably owes back to the conversation, or one of the questions near the top of the conversation about how most students, I really think there is a perception among students that the career service is there for their supposed skilled work, their graduate opportunities, as opposed to the job at the pub around the corner. When we're thinking about that already lack of understanding and perception of the way that universities can support a student with their working life, you can imagine the further complications and confusions that students are already facing, that a bit of monitoring could really help to challenge that. But I'm also aware that a lot of universities are measuring and looking at these different things and are asking their students how they're working, what they're working, because they're seeing the impacts that it's having.
Yeah, and I know a lot of institutions have also changed their timetables, so they're stacking the timetables into maybe 3 days a week on campus, so students having to travel less, but it also frees up more time for part-time work, which was a question that was later on, but I do know a number of institutions who have made that quite significant move to support their students, which is really good to see. Okay, Emma, can we have Chase Greenfield's mic on, please? And they can ask a question. Go for it, Chase.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's been a great discussion and so many interesting points. And I have a dozen questions, but the one that I think I'm being asked to follow back up on is I'm curious more, like Rose was struck, I was most struck by the impact statistics that Adrian helpfully presented at the beginning of the presentation. I was just curious if you'd be able to talk a little bit more about the methodology and the less likely to attain a good honors degree. Can you talk a little bit about some of the data that was compared with and how the projections of likelihood of attaining a good honors degree was arrived at? I'm just curious to know a little bit more on that side. Thank you.
Thank you, Chase. Go ahead, Adrian.
Yeah, so the data was derived from relative risk ratios, which I need to make sure that I get the description of those exactly right. But essentially, it's comparing two variables with another. So it's a statistical measure used to compare the likelihood of one particular outcome versus a particular group. So we explored the relationship between under and over 20 hours, and from that, we were able to understand the impact of paid work on that. It's not as developed as a statistical modelling. So, for example, with the quality of work question, where we looked at different components of quality of work, we don't look at the relationships between those individual components. It's just testing one variable with another. So further statistical analysis will be able to identify whether quality of work, for example, has a compound effect or not.
Okay, and another, sorry, to the other panelists, but another data question for Adrian. Are there any insights into this in Scotland, where the approach to the maintenance support system has been so different? So there's been much bigger rises in maintenance support for Scottish students in recent years. I know your report didn't cover that, Adrian, but I don't know if you've got any insights or either of the other panelists.
We didn't look at Scotland. From what we read around the topic, we didn't see any difference in terms of the experience that students have in any of the other of the nations, 4 nations than the UK. But we didn't look at Scotland specifically. It was focusing on English universities.
Okay. Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I'm just having a quick scan through the questions we have left. I'm going to actually skip to Benjamin Hunt because it's a question that we haven't had. So Emma, if you could pop Benjamin's mic on for me, please.
Hello, sorry, I was just struggling to connect the mic there. My question, thank you all for this panel and this really fascinating report. My question was going back to the point around crediting work experience in particular. So both placements and, as was mentioned by Amira before, and the core components of a program, which there's different practice across the sector but also the wider work experience that could be part-time work or outside. I just wanted the panel's reflections on that, because on the one hand, from a social mobility and social justice point of view, it seems clear that those skills are really important, particularly as technology is changing. The graduate premium to be maintained might require that. But on the other, it also requires universities to probably have a different relationship with employers, in particular in terms of crediting and whether that links in with sort of shorter modular design and other areas. So I just wondered what the panel's reflections were on that.
Thank you, Benjamin. Martin, I'm going to ask you for your answer there, but if you could keep it quite succinct, please.
Yep. So I think it's a good question. as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a really important area. Laura from Bath Spa has just mentioned in the comments there that they've got a degree where a module piloting at the moment where it's giving credit to this. So I think if we can look at models that do that, that's important. But I also think as well, we can see other data from not just this is all about Bath, but the University of Bath has also produced some research recently which shows a really clear link between better degree honours and work placement. So again, I think some more work to be done here about extrapolating the similar pathway from part-time work to this at this point as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to ask you for final comments, and then we're going to do this in 2 ways, and I'm going to be really strict on time. So my first final comment I would like from you is it better to do 10 hours a week in quality part-time work than to have no job at all when you're studying? You're not allowed to do any nuance, you just have to give me your answer. I'm waving the pen, so you know it's serious. And my second thing is, what one change would you like to see to support students that are in this situation? And Amira, I'm going to come to you first, please. Sorry.
I got unlucky. I have to go first. I think I'm going to surprise the audience by saying 10 hours quality time of work, but I don't get to explain why. So I'm going to have to deal with that. And then, sorry, what was the second half again?
So the second one was, what one thing would you like to see change?
I mean, the number one thing I'd like to see change is real support educating students on their rights, what they can do, where they need to take action, because a lot of people are getting treated incredibly poorly and don't have the ability to make the change that they need to.
Yeah, really good answer. Thank you. Adrian?
Yes to the first question.
So part-time, 10 hours.
10 hours yeah, absolutely. And then the second question, I would probably go with something that Martin referenced around a whole systems approach in universities to look at paid work, which encompasses career service support, academic registry, mitigating circumstances. So universities really working in lockstep to support students that are working.
Thank you. And Martin?
Definitely yes to the first one. And then on the second, I would say a really concerted effort in curriculum design and assessment to think of creative ways that we can reference, capture and recognize the skills development and attribute development that's taking place in part-time work. If nothing else, because employers are now far more interested in skills-based hiring than they are in degree qualification in terms of degree outcomes. And so this is a real benefit if we can get it right.
And there's something really important there about teaching students how to talk about the skills they have and talk about the experiences they have to those potential graduate employers. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. The 300 odd people that have been on the call, thank you. And for all your questions, and apologies those I didn't get to ask. Thank you to our panelists for your brilliant insights, and to Adrian and you and your colleagues for writing such an important report that I think will go on to have a positive impact on students. So really appreciate all the time and work that went into that. Thank you to Emma, who you can kind of see on screen, and Carol, who's in the background, who've put all of this together. Please keep following HEPI. We'll be talking about this much more, I'm sure. It's such a hot topic. So if you don't follow us already, just pop on the website and sign up for our daily emails and give us a follow on LinkedIn. Thank you very much, everybody.